down on his threat of tariffs, saying that time ran out to reach a deal. So, from 5 GMT this morning, the US imposed new charges on goods imported from Canada, Mexico and China.
In recent years, trade relations between the United States and Mexico have evolved in complex and often contentious ways. As global economic dynamics shift, both countries find themselves at a crossroads where long-established agreements are being tested, particularly under the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump. The introduction of new tariffs by the United States, aimed at protecting domestic manufacturing, marked a critical moment in these relations, sending shockwaves through the Mexican economy and affecting industries across the continent. This article delves into the unfolding drama, offering a detailed analysis of the political, economic, and social ramifications of the escalating trade tensions. The U.S. tariffs and their immediate impact. When the Trump administration announced tariffs on goods imported from Mexico, it was a significant blow to one of the most important trade partnerships in the world. Mexico, as the largest supplier of goods to the United States, plays a critical role in North America's economic landscape. Goods such as electronics, vehicles, agricultural products, and more flow across the border daily, forming a highly integrated supply chain that underpins the economic stability of both nations. The news of the tariffs immediately shook Mexico's markets. As soon as the announcement was made, the peso dropped sharply against the US dollar, losing over 5% of its value in just a few days. This devaluation placed immense pressure on Mexico's fragile economy, leading to inflationary pressures that affected everything from consumer goods to fuel prices. For businesses that depend on U.S. exports, the imposition of tariffs was a devastating blow. The political backlash in Mexico. In response to the tariffs, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum took a strong stance, vowing not to accept these impositions. At the heart of her rhetoric was a call for national respect and sovereignty. This was not just an economic crisis, but also a deeply political one, touching upon national pride and the complex relationship Mexico shares with its northern neighbor. President Sheinbaum led a massive protest at Mexico City's Zocalo Square, where tens of thousands of Mexicans gathered to express their anger. The crowd waved the Mexican flag proudly and chanted, "Mexico deserves respect," a slogan that resonated with the broader population's sense of injustice over the unilateral decisions made by the U.S. government. However, the Mexican government's response was not purely emotional. It was calculated and diplomatic. Recognizing that escalation could lead to further economic turmoil and potential long-term damage to Mexico's position in global trade, Sheinbaum and her government quickly shifted to a strategy of negotiation. Mexico understood that this confrontation could be a pivotal moment in the relationship, and the government's response would determine the future of U.S.-Mexico economic cooperation. Diplomatic negotiations and the temporary reprieve. In the face of mounting pressure from businesses, the public, and the global market, Mexico avoided a full-scale escalation by opting for negotiation. Within weeks of the tariff announcement, President Sheinbaum personally traveled to Washington to meet with U.S. officials, including President Trump. This high-stakes diplomatic meeting resulted in a temporary reprieve. The U.S. agreed to delay the implementation of tariffs on many goods covered under the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, until April 2nd. The temporary delay was celebrated by Mexico as a win, but it was far from a complete resolution. While the tariffs on most goods were put on hold, the U.S. government refused to lift tariffs on steel and aluminum, two critical materials for the North American auto industry. This decision left automakers on both sides of the border scrambling to adjust to the new reality. Impact on the North American auto industry. The North American automotive industry, which is one of the largest and most integrated in the world, was particularly hard hit by the tariffs. The region's auto supply chain is incredibly complex, with parts and materials often crossing the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times before a car is fully assembled. A single vehicle may cross the border up to 8 times during its production process. Each time the vehicle crosses the border, it incurs costs, and these costs add up quickly, especially under new tariff regimes. Ford, General Motors, GM, and Stellantis, formerly Fiat Chrysler, quickly raised alarms. The automakers warned that the rising production costs could result in higher car prices and potential factory closures. Ford, for example, indicated that tariffs could raise the price of its iconic F-150 truck by as much as $12,000, a significant increase that could push many consumers out of the market. Similarly, GM and Stellantis suggested that they might need to scale back production or close certain plants in response to the rising costs of materials, further compounding the potential for economic fallout in both the U.S. and Mexico. Electric vehicles, EVs, a growing segment of the global automotive market, were not immune to the effects of the tariffs. Many EV components, such as batteries, sensors, and electric motors, are sourced from Mexico. With the imposition of tariffs on these materials, the cost of manufacturing electric vehicles rose sharply, further complicating efforts to meet the growing demand for affordable EVs in the market. As automakers struggle to balance these rising costs, consumers are likely to face higher prices for electric cars as well. The broader economic consequences. While the automotive industry is one of the most directly impacted sectors, the ramifications of the tariffs reverberated throughout the entire North American economy. Financial markets responded negatively to the uncertainty introduced by the tariffs. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, a key indicator of the U.S. economy, dropped more than 700 points in the days following the announcement. The fear of trade war and economic slowdown was palpable in the markets, as investors reacted to the potential for escalating tensions. The Mexican economy, already dealing with inflation and slow growth, faced further challenges. The weakening of the peso exacerbated the situation, making imports more expensive and creating a vicious cycle of rising domestic prices. This led to greater public discontent, as everyday Mexicans saw their purchasing power decrease. For businesses, the rising costs of production added further strain, pushing many smaller companies to the brink of financial collapse. Mexico's strategic countermeasures. In response to the U.S. tariffs, Mexico quickly pivoted to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. The government actively sought new trade partners, opening negotiations with countries like Brazil, China, and other South American nations. Mexico aimed to diversify its export markets and ensure that it was not overly dependent on its northern neighbor for economic stability. These diplomatic and trade efforts could have a lasting impact on the flow of goods across the Americas. Mexico's growing ties with China, for example, could signal a shift in the balance of trade in the Western Hemisphere. If successful, these moves could reduce Mexico's dependence on the U.S. and open up new avenues for growth, although it would also involve some risks, given the tensions between the U.S. and China. Additionally, Mexico implemented retaliatory tariffs on key U.S. agricultural exports, including corn, soybeans, and avocados. These goods are major exports from the U.S. to Mexico, and by imposing tariffs on them, Mexico sent a clear message of resistance. Farmers in Texas and California, who heavily depend on the Mexican market for their agricultural products, found themselves caught in the crossfire. The increased costs and reduced demand for U.S. exports placed additional strain on these farmers, already grappling with rising production costs and unpredictable market conditions. The path forward, a high-stakes game of trade and diplomacy. The temporary suspension of the tariffs under the USMCA is set to expire on April 2nd, and the future of U.S.-Mexico trade remains uncertain. If no resolution is reached before that deadline, the full 25% tariffs will take effect across all sectors, leading to even greater economic and political turmoil. The question now is whether the two countries can find common ground, or if the situation will escalate into a full-scale trade war. President Sheinbaum and her government are under intense pressure to resolve the crisis in a way that minimizes damage to Mexico's economy while maintaining national dignity and sovereignty. The decision to engage in diplomatic negotiations was a critical one, but it remains to be seen whether it will lead to a lasting resolution or if tensions will flare up again. For businesses in both Mexico and the United States, the future remains uncertain. The automotive industry, in particular, is at a crossroads, and the full impact of these tariffs could take years to fully unfold. The North American economy as a whole will be forced to reckon with the consequences of these trade tensions, which may permanently alter the economic landscape of the continent. The U.S. trade war with China. A strategic shift. In 2025, following the announcement of a 20% tariff on Chinese goods, the economic battlefield took an even sharper turn. While the U.S. government hoped to stem the flow of Chinese imports, it inadvertently paved the way for Beijing to diversify its trading partners. With the U.S. and China locked in a tariff battle, the Chinese government sought alternative markets, which led to dramatic shifts in both energy and agricultural trade. China, as a key global player in manufacturing, technology, and energy consumption, found new trade relationships that positioned it as a central force in the evolving global economy. One of the most significant impacts of this trade war is seen in the energy sector. For decades, the United States was China's largest supplier of crude oil and natural gas. But, in early 2025, the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian oil imports. This move had unintended consequences, most notably the redirecting of China's energy imports toward Canada. The Canadian government, in turn, seized the opportunity to increase its energy exports to China through the Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX) pipeline. This upgrade allowed Canada to increase its crude oil export capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day, securing a direct and cost-effective route to Asia. For Canada, this shift marked a monumental change in its position on the global stage. With the U.S. cutting off access to Chinese markets, Canada swiftly reaped the rewards, cementing itself as one of China's primary energy suppliers. This marked a dramatic departure from the decades-old U.S.-China energy relationship, leaving the U.S. vulnerable to a potential decline in its energy influence on the world stage. Additionally, Canada's burgeoning role as a major LNG liquefied natural gas exporter further cemented its place in China's long-term energy strategies. The LG Canada project, slated to begin operations in 2025, is set to become one of North America's largest LNG export facilities, with a capacity to export up to 26 million tons per year. Once again, the U.S. found itself relegated as China turned to other nations, including Canada, Qatar, and Australia, to diversify its energy imports. The agricultural sector. The shifting supply chains. While the energy market is one of the most visible areas of change, the agricultural sector has also felt the brunt of the trade war. Historically, the U.S. has been one of China's largest agricultural suppliers, particularly in the realm of soybeans, wheat, corn, and pork. In fact, in 2016, the U.S. supplied a staggering 40% of China's soybean imports. However, by 2024, that share plummeted to just 18%, as China sought alternative sources due to the tariffs imposed by Washington. In place of U.S. exports, countries in South America and Europe have taken up the mantle, with Brazil and Argentina now accounting for a significant 74% of China's wheat, corn, and cotton imports. Perhaps the most striking example of this shift has been in the pork industry. Spain and the Netherlands, previously minor players in global pork exports, have now emerged as the dominant suppliers of pork to China. This change was driven by stronger food safety regulations, more stable supply chains, and competitive pricing compared to U.S. exports. In 2023 alone, EU pork exports to China surged by 35%, while U.S. pork exports fell dramatically, further solidifying China's shift away from American agricultural products. For U.S. farmers, this has been nothing short of a disaster. The tariffs and China's pivot to other countries have caused a severe oversupply of U.S. agricultural goods. As China slashed its purchases of U.S. soybeans, pork, and other agricultural products, American farmers faced plummeting prices, declining profits, and mounting financial strain. Smaller farms, already struggling under the weight of economic pressures, were hit hardest. Without the ability to quickly pivot to new markets or industries, these farms are increasingly at risk of bankruptcy, deepening the economic crisis in rural America. The U.S. industrial sector and the growing disconnect. The damage caused by the trade war has not been confined to agriculture alone. America's industrial sector, particularly its technology giants, is also feeling the pain. As China diversifies its trade partners, American companies, particularly those in the tech sector such as Google, Tesla, and Intel, are losing market share in one of the world's most lucrative markets. China's strategy of moving toward Canadian and European suppliers has had a domino effect on the U.S. industrial sector. Once seen as the dominant global player, U.S. tech companies are now battling for relevance as China seeks alternatives that are not subject to the political and economic volatility caused by Washington's trade policies. This shift has had a long-term impact on U.S. global influence. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a strong presence in the global tech market. But as China strengthens its ties with Canada and Europe, it signals a weakening of American economic dominance. The loss of access to the Chinese market means billions of dollars in revenue lost for U.S. tech giants, and the potential for permanent shifts in the global tech supply chain. The global shift: winners and losers in a changed world. As the U.S. faces economic fallout from its trade policies, other countries are capitalizing on the opportunity to fill the void left by American exports. Canada, in particular, has emerged as one of the most significant beneficiaries of the U.S.-China trade war. Beyond the energy and agricultural sectors, Canada has managed to capture billions of dollars in lost U.S. trade, positioning itself as a key player in global markets. Similarly, the European Union, particularly countries like Spain and the Netherlands, has significantly increased its share of the Chinese market for agricultural exports, especially pork. In the long run, the United States risks becoming more isolated as the world adjusts to a new economic order. With China turning to other suppliers for key commodities, the U.S. is facing the reality that its global economic influence may never return to the levels it once enjoyed. This shift has profound implications for the U.S. economy, particularly in industries like agriculture, technology, and energy, which rely heavily on global markets. A strategic miscalculation or a bigger plan? The big question now is whether this trade war is a strategic miscalculation by the U.S. or part of a larger, more complex plan to shift the global economic balance. On one hand, the U.S. government seems intent on pushing through its protectionist agenda, aiming to reduce reliance on foreign imports and increase domestic manufacturing. However, this approach has also sparked unintended consequences that are eroding America's position in the global economy. With companies shifting their supply chains, energy deals being renegotiated, and agricultural products flowing elsewhere, the question remains: can the U.S. recover from this? The alternative is even more concerning. If the U.S. continues down this path, it risks further alienating its allies, reducing its influence in global trade, and creating opportunities for competitors like Canada, the EU, and China to fill the gaps. The longer the U.S. sticks to its aggressive tariff policies, the more difficult it will become to regain its previous position in the global marketplace. Conclusion: the future of U.S. economic power. The global economic landscape is rapidly changing, and the U.S. is at a crossroads. Whether this trade war marks the beginning of a long-term decline in U.S. economic dominance or simply a temporary shift remains to be seen. However, the results of these policies are already evident in the reorientation of trade alliances, the redirection of energy and agricultural exports, and the diversification of supply chains. Canada and the European Union, two long-standing U.S. allies, have found themselves in a position to capture billions of dollars in trade that would have otherwise flowed to the U.S. The U.S. is not only losing ground in its trade war with China, but also risking its place as the world's preeminent economic power. As the world adjusts to these new realities, the question remains: will the U.S. rethink its trade policies and re-establish its leadership on the world stage? Or is this the beginning of a new global order, where other powers, not the U.S., dominate the global economy? Time will tell. But one thing is certain: the global balance of economic power is shifting, and the U.S. is at risk of being left behind.